Good afternoon, everyone. It's fantastic to welcome you to this webinar. I'm Dianne Smith, and on behalf of the Melbourne Chamber of Commerce, welcome to the 9th COVID-19 Business Leaders webinar. Our aim has been to ensure that you have the right access and input into the policy decisions affecting the business community, and also that you're able to gain access to the support services and the information that the Chamber can provide to help you in the recovery of from this crisis. And if you've been watching any of the news media over the past couple of weeks, you will have missed, or you could not have missed, the prominence of race and diversity. These are really important issues and complex issues, and we are keen to address part of this today in the timely topic of jobs and diversity in today's forum, in the context, of course, of COVID-19, where we're seeing increased unemployment and other labour concerns. So first, we'll start with the general advocacy update by the Chief Executive of the Victorian Chamber of Commerce and Industry, Paul Guerra, and then Paul will be followed with a discussion on the impacts of COVID-19 on labour market and workplace diversity. Now, you'll hear some really interesting insights from two of our members. We have Jay Munro from Indeed, the world's largest job site, and we have Anita Ziemer, who's the Executive Director of Slade Group in the Interchange Bench. And Anita is has incredible expertise on recruitment, but she's also very passionate about women's career development. So just by way of a brief introduction, diversity and equality in the workplace has long been a focus in Victoria, and it's had increased attention over the past couple of years. Earlier this year, in February, the state government passed the Gender Equality Act to improve workplace gender equality across the Victorian public sector, universities and local councils. In 2019, they also introduced their social procurement framework, which, among other things, encourages government bodies to purchase from Aboriginal-owned businesses. And the Victorian Chamber, and as you're aware, we are part of the Victorian Chamber, has worked very closely with the state government to develop these laws and policies. And we're continuing to work with you as businesses to help you meet the diversity, the new obligations and the new requirements. For example, we can do workplace culture surveys, we can do drafting equal opportunity and recruitment policies, and we can advise members on aligning your strategies with legislative and operational requirements. So thank you very much for joining us today. I would like to also note we have the President of the Victorian Chamber, Karen Sobels, on the line, and two of our board members, Brian Negus and Michelle Windsor. And we do encourage all of the participants in the webinar to lodge any questions for any speaker at any time using the chat function. So everyone's in listening only mode to start off with, and this webinar is recorded. So with that, I'd like to invite Paul Guerra to provide a bit of an update over the past week.
Thanks, Dianne, and welcome everybody. Special welcome to a very good friend of mine, Anita Ziemer. You'll absolutely be delighted listening to Anita today. She is one of the most influential and inspirational leaders in our great town. So Anita, looking forward to that. And Jay, who I've met over the past couple of weeks, and looking forward to getting to know Jay more, particularly through the session today. So I'm looking forward to that. So let me not take up too much time. So we've got more time with our two great leaders today. So busy period for us, and no doubt you would have heard the appropriate noise that we're making today. First, for the Victorian Chamber, we've partnered up with the Australian Industry Group to make a really clear statement to the Victorian government, and that is we are falling behind. This will put in jeopardy not only businesses but jobs if we do not get moving. We believe there's a need for a plan. In fact, we're really clear about it today in that we have two crises. For the first time I can remember, we've got two crises occurring at the same time. The first crisis is the health crisis. COVID-19, as we've come to know it, is a health crisis. It's a pandemic. The state is doing a wonderful job at managing that pandemic. And we're doing a wonderful job collectively managing that pandemic. But there is another crisis that's now with us as well, and that is a business and jobs crisis. As much as we have a plan for the health crisis, we need a plan for the business and jobs crisis. And that's what we've asked for today out of the state government. We believe there is a way through this, but certainly sitting and ignoring it, hoping that it will go away, will not be the case. Quite simply, there is no cure for AIDS. There is no cure for AIDS. Right? There may not be a cure for COVID. So by staying locked down, that is not going to serve anybody any good. We need to get going again. So we're really strong about that today. Just in terms of other state matters, we've pushed really hard against wage theft. We've actually pushed really hard against workplace manslaughter as well. The numbers are with the government, so certainly wage theft got through, and we expect workplace manslaughter to get through as well. Our rationale behind that, pushing against those, is really clear. In case of wage theft, we do not support wage theft in any way, shape or form, but at the same time, we recognise that under the federal government's regime, wage theft should be picked up there. And industrial manslaughter, now is not the time to introduce it, quite frankly, given what we're dealing with, and there needs to be a bit more consultation with industry. That said, it will get through. These are two laws that will impact you in your business in Victoria, and we suggest you get across them, and the Chamber will be making opportunity to help you get across those as well. We also pushed hard for the gas moratorium bill to get through as well, and we supported the government on that. We're delighted that it did get through. The government had the numbers to get that through as well, although it was looking shaky over the weekend, I must admit. So we did apply some pressure there, which I'm pleased to say got through. I spoke to the Federal Treasury yesterday about regional Victoria, gave some insights in terms of what we're seeing. The picture in terms of COVID is really positive out in regional Victoria. The picture in terms of jobs, particularly youth, is not so rosy, and we think there needs to be some specific work done through regional Victoria as well. So we'll continue to pick that up with the Federal Treasury as well. We're also engaging actively with the 5 streams that the federal government has introduced through the Prime Minister and Christian Porter. So as most of you will know, we have a great connection with the Australian Chamber of Commerce. And our President, Karen Sobels, and myself are actually directors of the Australian Chamber of Commerce as well. 2 of the people that will be in each of the 5 work streams work out of our Melbourne office, which is fabulous. So at the right time, the Melbourne Chamber group will get an opportunity to meet those 2 people, because we want your input around, as we go through this industrial relation change, what are the things that you're seeing? What are the things that will be good for your business that we can roll into the federal government initiatives there? So it's been a busy period. Neil Mitchell today was really good. There'll be more coverage on the news tonight. Anything you can do to lend your support to the idea of around getting a business and jobs plan back on, we'd certainly appreciate it. And with that, I'll hand you back to Dianne.
Thank you very much, Paul. It's now my pleasure to introduce Jay Munro. Jay's been working in the recruitment and advertising industry for more than 20 years and is now the Australian Country Manager for Indeed, as I said before, the world's #1 job site. Now, Jay's got some fantastic data to share, and with that, I'm going to hand over to you now, Jay.
Thanks so much, Dianne. It's really good to be here today to share some of the insights that Indeed has gathered and formed over the last few months as well. And I'm going to just share some of that data with you now. Okay. So over 2 months have now passed since COVID-19 really started to, I guess, rock Australia's economy, leading to an extremely fast deterioration of economic and market conditions. And we know that few businesses were immune, and many of us have been impacted by the changes that have occurred to our everyday lives now, and many aspects of our everyday lives. However, we are starting to slowly emerge, though it's a very different market and world that we're now beginning to enter into. Today, I'll very quickly walk through some of the economic impacts and data points that we've collected and analysed, or that our economist has. I can't take credit for that. And begin addressing some of the important aspects of diversity when it comes to recruitment and employment. Whilst we wait for the latest data to be released, today I'll share insights that lead us up until the end of April. And I encourage you to register and attend the next update given by our economist, Callum Pickering, which is actually happening very soon on June 30th. And the registration link, I believe, will be sent out to you. Firstly, as COVID-19 has resulted in such a quickly changing environment, the typical ways of measuring and reporting on employment and economic conditions has changed, at least for now. And the data that we're looking at here is from March 14th until May 2nd. And what it's telling us is that Australian payrolls have declined by 7.3% since the 14th of March. Now, that actually translates into between 900,000 to 1 million jobs being lost within about a month and a half period. Of all the states, as you can see here, Victoria has been hardest hit as well. And if we break that up into an industry level, looking at the change in payrolls across Australia, it's probably no surprise that accommodation and food services was the industry that suffered most, followed by arts and recreation services. But we should also consider Australians ourselves. And as Paul mentioned, the youth here, looking at the effect on payrolls with gender and age diversity in mind, we can see that our youngest and our eldest candidates were most affected. So those being under 20 and over 70 years of age. But we can also see that for those age groups and our next youthful bracket of 20 to 29-year-olds, women were more affected than their male counterparts. It's actually interesting to see that there really was a significant impact on women within those groups compared to men. However, in other age groupings, males were more affected, though with lower margins of difference. So that's really quite, a startling difference there. When we look at unemployment rates for Australia, we can see here sharp spikes as we hit 2020 at the end there, or into 2020. Or more accordingly, that's as COVID-19 hit us. Now, unemployment rates have traditionally been the measure we use to determine labour market health in Australia, rather than payrolls. And whilst it never tells us the full story, and it usually does a good enough job. However, that's not so much a case during COVID-19. And right now, there's a range of issues with looking at the unemployment rate as a measure. But we'll put those to the side today because it's quite a lengthy discussion to look at all those factors, and we'll just focus on the data that we have at hand here. So the unemployment rate shown here hit 6.2 in April. But when we look at these other important indicators shown, like underemployment, which accounts for those who are employed but looking to work more hours, it jumped from 8.9% in March to 13.7% in April. And then the underutilization rate, which is that orange line there, and that's a sum of the underemployed and the unemployed, that actually rose to 19.9% in April, which is well above its level during our last recession back in the 90s. And we actually expect all of these measures to shift even higher in the May results. When it comes to recruiters or employers, we can take a look at Indeed's job posting data. And here we note that hiring activity slowed sharply since mid-March. And right now, postings are tracking around 52% lower than the trend at this point last year. But there's certainly been some signs of improvement. You can see that trend line, which indicates new postings on Indeed, has actually doubled since mid-April. But that's a really positive development, but there's still a very long way to go. And with those, very brief economic updates in mind, if we now switch the focus to diversity, with the thought that more Australians are out of work now and looking, based on that data that I just presented, it means that there'll be more competition for job seekers to find and secure employment. And this change in the market has somewhat repositioned us into an employers or a recruiters market again, whereby you as a hiring organisation have greater selection of candidates than we've had in a rather long time. Because of this, it's certainly important and timely that we actively think about and consider diversity when it comes to recruitment, as this new large pool of job seekers most certainly has candidates of diverse backgrounds and abilities within it. Now, knowing our processes impact the attraction and retention of diverse employees and of course supports them in their applications is extremely important. Diversity of talent offers a business diverse ways of thinking and improved understanding of diverse customers and the support that they need. And it adds to workplace culture, improving engagement and employee loyalty as well. Studies have also shown that diverse workforces contribute to better innovation and commercial and financial outcomes for a business. Yet when it comes to recruitment, we tend to have all these various barriers in place when hiring that preclude us from growing diverse workforces. Many of these barriers are due to unconscious biases, both ours and job seekers actually, and include formation of first impressions, reliance on stereotypes and what people look like, random information that enters and distracts us, and of course the well-known and studied halo effects. One particular bias that exists was identified in various studies and has become quite a popular talking point more recently. And one of those studies appeared in the Harvard Business Review. It highlighted a moment in the recruitment process that specifically impacts gender diversity. Now, these experiments studied the way that men and women responded to job advertisements, particularly the requirements in those ads. When we look at job ads, many recruiters and hiring managers tend to create long lists of requirements. And we've seen this style of ad for many years now. And I guess, sure, we need to specify what's required, in order to do the job effectively. But over the last, more than 10 years, I've seen some ads that have 10 or 20 bullet points in them, which is really asking far too much of a candidate. And little do many of us realize that these long lists can actually prevent you from attracting applications from women. Now, studies have shown that when it comes to going through those bullet points or that long list of requirements, women feel that they need to meet a much higher number of those requirements before they feel confident enough to apply for the job when compared to men who feel they need to meet a much fewer number of those requirements. So whilst that may be a job seeker's unconscious bias, we can actually help to reduce that and encourage greater gender diversity of applicants from the very beginning. Now, of course, we have much more than just gender diversity to think about as well. And when we look at other employment participation and unemployment rates, there's also untapped pools of candidates as shown here who'll add to the diversity of your workforce. So as we can see here, the participation rates of candidates with disabilities from Indigenous backgrounds or who've been taken in under humanitarian circumstances is significant. And unemployment much higher than the average in these groups than we see across the general labour force. This indicates a potentially untapped talent pool, but we need to think about what we can do to support these diverse candidates in the application and onboarding with our organisations. Now, in thinking about diversity and how we encourage those job applicants, it's increasingly important that we review and start identifying how our recruitment processes may prevent candidates from applying. We need to make them more accessible and adaptable to fit the needs of diverse candidates. If we look at some of these stats, they indicate significant volumes of people in Australia who may need those adaptations to your process and can offer your business great talent and skill, but unless we make those changes, they'll be unable to join your workforce without us helping to enable them to do so. Now, as an example, 1 in 70 Australians are on the autism spectrum. So how do we make adjustments to help those candidates apply, interview, onboard, and engage with our organisations? Are we introducing stereotyping as a bias here, which I hear so much from some different organisations around the country? Do we assume that those on the spectrum are only suitable for statistical, mathematical, or analytical type roles? Now, I can very comfortably argue that case, considering that I personally am on the spectrum and have successfully fulfilled very different types of jobs to those during my career. And it would be, my worst nightmare to work in a mathematics type job. So we need to have more consideration to what these individuals actually want rather than what we think they'll be good at. Now, 1 in 10 have a form of dyslexia. So what help are we giving to those applicants? Going through the recruitment process, someone with dyslexia may be struggling and that increases anxiety. What are we doing to comfort them and give them that help to guide them through? And 1 in 5 have a disability. So how are we communicating support for disabilities and then also communicating inclusive practices and inclusion policies for these talent pools in order to encourage them to apply and build those diverse workforces? So finally, from me, I think it's pertinent to have a quick review of racial diversity as well. And for this, unfortunately, there isn't a huge amount of data for Australia that I specifically have that looks at the recruitment process at hand anyway. However, this was a study which I think is very important to refer to. It was conducted by ANU. And in this experiment, they submitted 4,000 fictitious resumes to jobs with a mixture of Anglo-Saxon, Indigenous, Italian, Chinese, and Middle Eastern sounding names to determine if there was any type of bias or discrimination against minority groups in the labour market. Unfortunately, it seems that there was, with applications with names connoting the 4 minority groups garnering lower callback rates than those with Anglo-Saxon names, even though they were all competent in terms of their skills and experience. I can't express enough how important it is to not only build diverse workforces, but to look at your processes and see if they're accessible and supportive of diverse candidates. There are untapped talent pools out there, and these candidates often face barriers that others don't. Considering that more candidates are now going to be in that job-seeking pool, we don't want these diverse candidates to be further marginalised or make it even more difficult for them to apply to our organisations. So that's all from me, and I'll hand it back to Dianne.
Thank you very much, Jay. Those really interesting data, and just picking up on your point about the talent pool for people who have disabilities, if any of the membership out there hadn't already connected with one of our other members, Jen Yu, they certainly have a specialisation in that area, and it's worthwhile considering reaching out to them. So really appreciate that, Jay. Our next speaker is Anita Ziemer. Anita, as I said before, is the Executive Director of the Slade Group and the Interchange Bench, which is the Melbourne head office national recruitment and HR services firm. Anita's an accomplished speaker on this topic, jobs and diversity, and she does inform me that she's also personally working on improving her own self-awareness of her own racial bias and putting in place programs to assist her clients as well understand theirs. So with that, I'd like to pass over to you, Anita.
Thanks, Dianne, and hi everybody, and thanks, Jay. I really found that really interesting. I like the big data. It's very interesting. I'd like to supply some raw data points on gender and racial diversity, and I will be focusing a lot today on racial diversity rather than gender. I'll show you some of the gaps that we need to bridge in terms of our senior leadership numbers. I'll share a wonderful diagram that shows how we might take that journey from maybe unaware to awareness to actively aware. And then we'll talk through a little bit about approaches to recruitment that can help us overcome our lack of racial diversity in our workplaces, in our senior leadership team. And I will reference the halo effect, Jay. So in terms of where we are in terms of senior executive teams with racial diversity are shown to have about a 21% more likely average profitability. And this is from a range of research that's been done by the ASX, by CEW, Group of 8, McKinsey, Forbes, Diversity Australia, and also the Human Rights Commission. Beyond gender, the racial diversity shows that we've got 33% improvement in profitability. And overall, when we look at Australia versus the US and the UK, we are actually tracking better in terms of diversity of women in senior executive roles, and certainly at board levels, as we know the ASX has set particular targets, and we know that there are a number of funds that won't invest in organisations where there isn't gender diversity on the boards at 30%. Where it gets less positive is where you look at senior leadership and racial diversity. So there was a survey done of 2,500 executives across ASX-listed companies, and 97% of leaders come from Anglo-Celtic or European backgrounds. And it fits a little bit, Jay, with your research reference from the ANU in terms of the prejudice that people from other nationalities and surnames experience on their way into an organisation. And the same way that I think the US experience is that the African Americans often feel very marginalised. Here it would be the Australian Asian experience. And when you consider that 7 of our top 10 export partners are in Asia, I think there's a real call to address this. So going back to that leadership piece, just looking at that third column along, what is our percentage in the population? We've got 58% of the population is Anglo-Celtic, 18% is European, and nearly 25%, so a quarter of our population is non-European and Indigenous. But when you look at the percentage of senior leaders, we are way underperforming in terms of having the diversity that we should be having amongst our senior leaders. So we're overweighted on Anglo-Celtic and European, and we're completely underweighted on non-European and Indigenous. So why does that matter? I thought it was really interesting with the, I don't know who wouldn't have seen the 60 Minutes or read or heard more about the branch stacking dramas in Victoria recently. But Adam Somyurek mentioned in that interview, he said the Turks, the Indians, the Anglos. He was grouping Australians into groups of racial demographics. And I thought that was a very interesting view from a politician, that was how he viewed the community. And so as an organisation and in the business community, I think we have a great opportunity to impact our broader society, because every time we introduce somebody from non-European and Indigenous backgrounds into our organisations to reweight that difference, we're impacting their employment. We're ultimately, I imagine, going to grow the middle class, which is something that's on everybody's mind. It's shrinking middle class, the family impact, the self-agency that gives people, and also our connectedness beyond work. And that's why beyond profitability, it is actually the right thing to do, not just for the organisation, but for our broader community. So how do we become more aware and perhaps less anti-racist? This is a really beautiful diagram that my niece, who works with many diverse groups in Arizona and US, sent me. It was prepared by a doctor in Minneapolis called Andrew Ibrahim, and I'm very happy to share it with you if you'd like a copy of it. And it shows that from the fear zone to the learning zone to the growth zone, it's about individuals and in turn organisations' opportunity to become far less racist and embrace their awareness for good. So, for example, the fear zone, I'll just take 3 examples here. The fear zone, inner circle, I avoid hard questions. So that hard question for me might be, why is my senior leadership team not reflective of the Australian population? If I avoid that, I never have to address it. But then if I go into my learning zone and I seek out questions that make me feel uncomfortable, maybe then I will be prepared to ask the question, what are we going to do to bring in and then importantly develop more non-Anglo and Europeans into our organisation? And then the growth zone is I speak out when I see racism in action. And to Jay's point again, sometimes it's not conscious racism, but it's maybe how we assess CVs, how we interview, etc. So it's a really terrific model for taking our awareness along that way. I'd also like to mention a podcast that I'm a big fan of, and some of you might also be, called The High Low. Pandora Sykes and Dolly Alderton in the UK to do a terrific weekly podcast. And in the June 3rd edition about anti-racism resources, I found it to be a really interesting, insightful, and sometimes uncomfortable broadcast, because it's two white privileged women talking about their own lack of awareness. And their guest, Candice Braithwaite, who's a UK author of Dark Skin, talked about her personal experience, which, as somebody who's an educated white privileged female in Australia, I really found interesting, because I've never had to think about it. So I'm probably way behind where many of you are, but it is something that we are all, I suppose, have a much more heightened awareness. So how do we take all this into recruitment? Yeah, who knew? Most of us hold unconscious biases when recruiting. So it does start with at the top. I don't think anybody will go into changing their recruitment approach unless they really want to see a change in the makeup of their organisation's demographics. So how do our unconscious biases come into play in recruitment? The halo effect is when we assume that somebody who's nice and friendly is also going to be smart and capable just because we like them. It's a really interesting phenomenon. By contrast, the horn effect is the opposite. If we see somebody who's perhaps too loud or too shy, we don't quite understand them, then we put them into the negative camp. And in fact, that might have nothing to do with how they're potentially going to perform. The contrast effect plays in part to the halo effect. So you'll be running panel interviews, you might be seeing 3 or 4 people in a row. The person with the halo effect was your preferred candidate. Somebody else comes in and you immediately contrast with them. Well, I didn't like her as much as I like Jay. So immediately you're not going to be objective about what it is these people bring to the table. The confirmation bias is something that probably we all do subconsciously. We want to confirm our pre-existing beliefs. For example, if we believe that a particular nationality or a degree or a particular university is best, then we will seek out the answers that agree with our ideals in that perspective. And conformity bias is something that is the problem of agreement. So again, you've got 3 or 4 people interviewing, and Dianne, Lucy and Jay will think one thing. It's more than likely, even if I think something else, that I'll agree with them about their point of view. There's a really great model that you can use to overcome that, which is referenced by the Abilene paradox. It's something else I can take offline with you. And it's about overcoming agreement, because that conformity bias is not really useful. And then the last one is the personal similarity bias, which is a little bit like the halo effect. If an interviewee is similar to yourself or acts in ways that remind you of people who you like, you have a preferred tendency to want to work with them. And it goes back to that. We don't have to inquire into somebody's background if we fundamentally know their race, their culture, their socioeconomic background. But that's not a very useful way to build diversity into an organisation. It's sometimes known as affinity bias, and it plays out in the general ethos where people say they're a good culture fit. I've for a while been worried a little bit about culture fit, because I sometimes think it's exclusionary. We use culture fit as a way of saying, well, they're just like us, they're going to work. But what does that really mean? I think digging deeper into culture is a very hard piece of work to do. So I'm going to leave you there with those challenges. Look forward to the Q&A, and it's been terrific to speak with you today.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Anita. And it was terrific to hear from you as well. Culture fit. I have always wondered about that expression as well. They're a good cultural fit. It's just an incredibly broad statement, and who knows exactly what that means. Thank you very much. Now, I might, while you're still in speaking mode, Anita, I might direct the first question to you, if that's okay. We've got a lot of people who are HR professionals on the line in this conversation, and they're, I would suspect, fairly passionate about diversity and probably understand the benefits of diversity. For those sorts of people, how would you advise them to influence other senior colleagues and superiors, board members, to support this shift and to embrace the benefits of investing more heavily in diversity in the workplace? What advice would you give?
Really good question, Dianne, and I'm sure some of our participants today have far more knowledge about this than me, but I would certainly start with understanding what their motivators are. So it depends on if the board is just about the results or if the organisation is just about meeting certain targets, then I would demonstrate with the data how diversity can match that. And there does seem to be a correlation with the numbers that are coming through with organisations that improve their diversity levels, not just at lower levels, but all the way up the organisation. So education is number one, and then it absolutely requires working with the line. Because if you have team leaders and managers who don't understand why the organisation is pushing for greater diversity and some of the challenges that might come to them in terms of leading day to day, then there's no hope that that can be successful. Because as Jay said, if you suffer from autism, then just assuming that you're going to fit in like everybody else is not going to lead to a successful outcome. So helping them develop the skills that allow diversity to thrive and grow in the organisation.
That leads nicely to a question I had for you, Jay. I thought it was interesting when you mentioned the bias that does exist on behalf of the job seeker. And you mentioned a couple of examples of that. But what do you think is happening during and leading up to post-COVID in terms of the type of biases that might be held by job seekers? Is it going to be different as we move into a whole new world post the COVID era?
I think that we now have an increased number of job seekers in market actively applying, and we've had some, I guess, challenges with recruitment for many, many years that candidates find it difficult with or become very, I guess, anxious around. One of the biggest problems that we've had is it's often referred to the candidate black hole. So a recruiter with all best intentions will receive applications, but they don't respond to all of them. And that can leave candidates, with that feeling of anxiety or the unknown and not knowing what's happening. The challenge that we can have is if you have more candidates in market, more applications coming in, the risk of that black hole increasing is actually something that, that risk increases, that candidates won't be responded to. If you've got those who, are struggling to make an application, do have anxiety around that already, then this is just going to add to that. So they may be put off from applying or deterred at the very beginning, and they may be the best candidate for the job. So that's my biggest concern, is that we won't be preparing for that increase in candidates that we may see come through. The other thing is that I think with COVID, we've kind of moved into video interviewing because we weren't able to do face-to-face. And with video, although it was something that we jumped on very quickly, we need to be very aware that some people will have problems or challenges with video interviews. So, for example, someone who is on the spectrum, it's difficult to maintain eye contact. They may not look at the camera They may be looking off, but that doesn't mean that they're not engaged. Someone may have some challenges with the way that they look, so dysmorphia, and they may not be as open in the beginning to turn their camera on. We need to be very aware of that and very supportive, and I guess more patient with the way that we respond to and treat candidates.
I find it difficult to know where to look, quite frankly. I'm sure a lot of people find that too. So just building on that, Jay, from an employer perspective, when people, we're talking about encouraging diversity. And so just once people actually do get recruited into an organisation, particularly young people or people who have come from diverse backgrounds, how easy is it for them to then speak out about the sorts of matters that you and Anita referred to before? I mean, surely that's quite a challenge. And would you like to comment, or perhaps this is another one for Anita, in terms of encouraging people to go into that growth zone that you mentioned, in terms of people being able to deal with the sort of issues we're dealing with more broadly in community? What advice would you give for those people?
I think it can become very dangerous for us to expect anyone to disclose any type of diversity or challenge that they may have. It's not a requirement. They don't have to do that. And we want to make sure that they feel safe and supported in order to start disclosing that. In terms of disclosure as well, it's very much an individual thing. And often we will disclose different amounts or different types of information to different audiences. So what I might disclose to a personal friend or to a partner will be very different to one another. What I disclose to a team member or someone I manage or my manager, those narratives may all be slightly different, but they'll be narratives that I'm comfortable with, that my employer has made me comfortable in actually sharing. So I think that the most important thing is never force anyone to disclose, but try to make a very supportive and inclusive environment where we can actually celebrate those differences and those diversities, because it's so enriching and valuable for the workplace cultures. That's what creates a culture from my perspective, is all these differences coming together and celebrating those and seeing the value that they add. So I think that's the key. Don't force people, but celebrate their difference.
And as you both said earlier, there are very good business reasons for doing so. Look, I'm just conscious of the time now. I thought I might just ask Anita and Jay, is there one particular tip to the people on the line that you would suggest that they can do to have a really big and long-lasting impact on diversity in our workplace before we go?
I'll jump in, Di. I think by working with each other, because it's often hard to do it on your own, but working with colleagues and saying, if we strip down this particular role, what is actually the core capability that we're looking for? And so when you take away all the periphery, the great communication skills, the experience, yada, 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 and you actually say, what do we look for in this role over the next 3 to 5 years? It actually helps you take away all those prejudices that you might hold, consciously or unconsciously, against people from different backgrounds or with a different set of experiences or pathways that you might have expected would come this way. So I think being hard on ourselves is the most difficult, but also probably the greatest opportunity.
Exactly. We're just on time, but Jay?
I'd say it's education. So, not just of hiring managers and executives, but of ourselves. And that's everyone, job seekers, managers, diversity leaders, absolutely everyone. There's so much to learn. No one knows it all. And we all have those prejudices that we need to understand and start to work with.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. I'm aware that we're right at the end of our time slot here. I feel like we've just scraped the top of this topic, and I think we need to revisit and have another chapter discussion on diversity in the workplace. But I really want to thank our speakers today, most sincerely, Anita Ziemer from Slade Group and Interchange Bench, and Jay Munro from Indeed. You've given us some fantastic data, and you've stimulated a conversation that I think is very useful for the Melbourne Chamber members. Just a quick thank you also to Samantha Cockrow from Slade, and also from Michael and Jasmine from the Indeed crew as well, and of course our own crew. Dianne, Lucy, Kath, really appreciate the whole team's effort. As you heard from Paul, the Victorian Chamber will continue our work to help getting Victorians back to business and the safe and appropriate easing of restrictions, and for a successful economy reboot. We do look forward to staying connected with you throughout this whole challenge. Thank you for your participation today, everyone, and until next time, good afternoon from us.